the introduction as well.
Okay. So you're going to start, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first seminar of 2023. Today, I'm happy to have Dr. Slava Merkin here, who is going to be talking about the Center for Geospace Storms and recent progress in their work. So Slava is the current director of the Center for Geomagnetic Storms and a principal staff member at APL, as well as a visiting scientist at NCAR and HOA. He has more than 20 years of experience in numerical modeling of space plasmas, and in particular, MHD simulations of the Earth's magnetosphere and inner heliosphere. He's contributed to research on magnetopause instabilities, magnetotail instabilities and reconnection, particle acceleration, and the magnetic structure of the heliosphere. Slava's current interests include understanding and describing the collective behavior of disparate domains of geospace, particularly during geomagnetic storms. So again, happy to have Slava here. Slava, if you would like to take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kyle and David, for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to share with everyone some of the recent results that are coming from this newly established Center for Geospace Storms, which is one of the NASA Drive centers. But I want to start by emphasizing the role of the early career scientists in the work that we do. I highlighted them here in red. None of this work would have been possible without their contributions. So all of the credit should go to them, and all of the blame should go to me. All right, so what I wanted to do today is, assuming there are early career scientists and graduate students in this virtual room, I wanted to start sort of from afar and place things into context. So I'll talk about the heliosphere and heliophysics as our place in the universe. I'll then talk about geospace as what we call now system of systems, which will lead me to the introduction of Center for Geospace Storms and of the model that we're building, which we'll call the MAGE or multi-scale atmosphere geospace environment model. And then I'll transition to discussing some of the recent results. It is impossible to talk about everything that's going on in this very large collaboration. So I picked a couple of sort of science highlights from our recent work on to the science themes of our center, and I'll then conclude my talk. One of the themes here I'll just mention, this is the third theme of CGS, simply because this is a magnetosphere seminar, so this is going down to the lower atmosphere, and I'll just highlight a couple of recent papers in that regard. All right, so placing things into context, so to speak, let's start from our place in the universe. This very nice image was compiled by Drew Turner, so it's all his credit. But you know, we live in an astrosphere. Our heliosphere is an astrosphere, which is a region or domain of universe that is formed by a star and its interaction with the interstellar medium. You can see a couple of stars here in a galaxy, and they're surrounded by astrospheres. So we live in the heliosphere, which is our local cosmos, or in other words, it's the astrosphere formed by the sun and its interaction with the interstellar medium. It's the only habitable astrosphere that we know of course, today. And what we do in heliophysics is we study the diverse plasma environments in the heliosphere. What makes us special, what makes heliosphere special for us, is that we, of course, can study it using many methods, including in situ observations, which is quite unique. The structure of the heliosphere that you can see on the left here I'm not gonna go into detail about this because we're gonna talk about a relatively small region just surrounding the sun here, which is within the 1 astronomical unit, which is the distance between the sun and the Earth, the inner heliosphere, and that's where the interaction of the sun with the planets and with the Earth is happening, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So obviously, all of heliophysics and all of space weather starts at the sun. Sun emits these enormous, it emits solar wind at all times, but sometimes it emits these enormous eruptions of plasma, which we call coronal mass ejections, which propagate through the interstellar medium. And is there a question? Sorry. Okay. So the coronal mass ejections propagate through the interplanetary medium and impact the Earth. This is what's causing all of the magnetospheric physics to happen and space weather as well. I wanted to show the slide to kind of put things in perspective. The coronal mass ejections are, of course, enormous relative to the scale of the Earth. This little ball here is actually drawn to scale just to demonstrate that our place, the place of the Earth in this system, is really, really small when put in perspective. And this is what it looks like when you zoom in on the Earth. So these bubbles of plasma that are threaded by the solar magnetic field are really enormous relative to the scale of the planet. So what happens when these enormous objects hit the Earth? Let me play the movie that the folks at the American Natural History Museum made based on our simulation. Oops, I'm not playing it, am I? No, let me. It's in a different Zoom window. I'm sorry for the interruption. Here we go again. The movie is so large I couldn't embed it in the PowerPoint. That's why this is happening. So we see the Earth here, and this is the lunar orbit. The sun is there in the background, and this is the Earth's magnetosphere. As we zoom in on this, this is the Earth's magnetic field being impacted by the solar wind and the coronal mass ejection here. This is a simulation of a storm. As we move in, you'll see what they called in the planetarium show the technosphere. These are the actual real spacecraft. Here is the geosynchronous orbit, and here's a lot of the real satellites that are orbiting the Earth at any given time. And so, obviously, when we talk about geomagnetic storms, we're talking about, in particular, space weather that affects all of this technological infrastructure, and then the movie goes into how the geomagnetic field is generated. So let me close this window and start sharing my screen again. Okay, so very briefly about space weather effects. I'm sure many of you know much more about this than I do, but there are effectively four major space weather hazards that we usually talk about. They include radiation in various manifestations. We talk about disruption of communications and ionospheric scintillation. We talk about currents that are induced inside the crust, so geomagnetically induced currents. Those affect all kinds of things, starting from tool recurrence in pipelines and failures in power systems and so forth. We talk about thermospheric expansion, which affects orbit prediction and satellite collision avoidance. So plenty of very real life consequences of this complex physics that we deal with in heliophysics in general. And so this brings me to this point in the talk where I would like to talk about the actual physics underlying the interaction of the sun and the coronal mass ejections with the Earth's geospace system, and the fact that the physics that's underlying space weather, the challenge of space weather, is a very multi-scale, and the system that we're dealing with is a very multi-physics system. What you see here on the left is the movie that I already played for you. This is the Earth's magnetosphere. In the middle is the polar view of the ionosphere thermosphere. This is from a recent simulation by Roger Varney that I'll talk about a little later in this talk. And on the right is a movie from the NCAR WECMX model of the atmospheric waves. And what we realize today, after decades of studying geospace, is that all of the systems, especially during storm time, interact with each other. They become activated. And so we must study geospace as a whole, as a coupled system of these subsystems, if we want to understand and ultimately predict space weather. It is also an important realization that we made as a community in the past few years, at least, is that what we call mesoscale processes are important in all of these domains in different ways, because they oftentimes lead to what we call emergent global behavior. In other words, they tend to accumulate into larger scale effects, creating large scale consequences. And finally, again, as we've been realizing in recent years, is that even lower atmosphere or middle atmosphere has effects on the ionosphere thermosphere, and vice versa. So we have to include coupling of all of these subsystems together if we want to, again, understand and predict space weather. So obviously, this is not the first time that something like this has been tried. We're following up in the steps of previous projects that have tried to deal with one way or another with this globally coupled system. There was the CISM project in the 2000s. This is a diagram of the model from Jimmy Rader's group now at UNH. And this is just to demonstrate to you how complex all of these coupled models are. Probably the more well-known model in the community is the SWMF framework from the University of Michigan. Obviously, a lot of work has been done in this field of global coupled geospace modeling in the past, but a lot more work remains to be done. And so this is what we're doing in this project, which we call the Center for Geospace Storms. We're kind of highlighting with this designation of geospace storms the fact that all of geospace systems during storms become activated and engage in this complex multi-scale and cross-domain interaction. And so we want to emphasize this by calling these events geospace storms. What we would like to do is, this is our vision, is to transform the understanding and predictability of space weather by realizing what I was just discussing before, the complex interaction of all of the different domains within geospace, basically recognizing geospace as a system of systems. It's a large multi-institutional collaboration. You can see on the bottom here, it's a collaboration between APL and NCAR, as well as four major universities in our field: Rice, UCLA, UNH, and Virginia Tech. And we have a prominent co-I, Joe Huber, who is at as a commercial entity at Syntac. So in short, the mission of the center is threefold: is to treat geospace holistically, to resolve mesoscale processes, and to couple geospace to the lower atmosphere. And I should mention that CGS is one of the 3 NASA Drive centers that were selected recently for phase 2 study. So what we're doing to achieve this vision and the mission of the center is, in part, we're building the model that we, like I said, called multi-scale atmosphere geospace environment, or MAGE. And just to demonstrate what we're talking about here, in the background here, you see the global magnetosphere with all of its complexity, with boundary instabilities, and an example mesoscale process, bursty bulk flows in the magnetotail. And I'll talk about this a little more later. But it's important to realize that this, what looks like just a thin film around the Earth, which looks like a passive boundary, inner boundary for the global magnetosphere, is really a world unto itself. If you zoom in on it and blow up, you'll see that it's a three-dimensional, very complex physically object with multiple scales involved and different physics involved, obviously. And so all of these physical processes interact or provide coupling with the magnetosphere, and so we need to treat them all holistically in one model while resolving all of these relevant processes that happen at smaller than global scales, which we call mesoscales. So I usually kind of skip over this slide, but I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about this, given that I have a little bit more time here. So this is sort of the mandatory coupling diagram of the MAGE model, of the coupling framework that we're talking about. So let me talk a little bit more about all of these different components here. So the backbone of this is the GAMERA global magnetosphere simulation, which is, or code, which is a redeveloped version of the what used to be called Lion Feather Mowbray LFM code that many in this community know. So the code was rewritten from scratch for this, but we retained the underlying numerics, sometimes improving it. But the code was rewritten with modern supercomputing architectures in mind. So obviously this is global magnetosphere, which is really not an MHD system, or not everywhere is an MHD system. So we're coupling to treat the inner magnetosphere with the Rice convection model, which is the RCM. I should say that in some cases, just like with what we did with GAMERA, we are not just using the codes, but rewriting them either substantially or entirely to make them also, all of the components, make them run efficiently together on modern supercomputing architectures. But as I'll talk about later in this talk, even models that couple global MHD models with ring current models are not sufficient in what we call now the tail transition region, which is basically in this region here, where the stretched magnetotail transitions into a more dipolar magnetic field, and where all of these bursty flows coming from the tail break and ultimately build up the ring current. So this is a very tricky region, which really no current models, no models that we have today treat, and this is why we are exploring using particle methods as we're doing here with the test particle code in understanding how to treat this transition region more self-consistently. We're also using some of the methods in the test particle code for particle precipitation, and you will hear about this, I think, next week. I'll mention it later. We also realized that no matter how well you try to represent the system with physics-based models, you still need to ingest data. There are still too many uncertainties, both in the ways of how physics is represented in our models and also in the uncertainties of, for example, boundary conditions and initial conditions. We need to ingest data into our models. In this particular case, we're using what essentially is data mining method from Misha Sitnov to derive both plasma pressures, and also more recently, this is actually not in this diagram because this is a really new development of ingesting or inciting X lines in the simulation based on data mining. So let me transition to the right here of this image and talk about this column here. You essentially have three models of the ionosphere here, which we're employing. The physics of the ionosphere is different depending on where you are looking at it. We have a separate model of the polar ionosphere or generalized polar wind. We have a model of the lower latitude, mid-latitude to equator ionosphere represented by SEMI, and underlying them there is a model from NCAR, which is WACMX, which couples the upper lower atmosphere to the ionospheric model that calculates ion transport. What we're trying to do here is to develop what we call a unified ionosphere model, which will sort of seamlessly transition across all the different latitudes without artificial boundaries anywhere in between these models. And underlying all of them is, or will be right now, we're still starting to develop this, is a model of the global ionospheric electrodynamics, which will also provide a global electrodynamic solution, electric field and potential solution to all of the models that use it, use that electric field to push their plasma. So what we did in the past now 2.5 years or so, soon will be 3 years, in phase one of the drive centers was we coupled these 3 or 4 pieces together, however you look at it, GAMERA, just the high latitude of the electrodynamic solver for now, RCM, and the predecessor to WACMX GCM from the NCAR. Not only did we couple these models, we did it at a very high resolution, which I'm citing here. These are not arbitrary numbers. This resolution is what we believe is important for treating the mesoscale process that I mentioned earlier. In particular, this is the resolution that we require to resolve these mesoscale bursty flows in the tail, which we call bursty bulk flows and ring current injections. And this is the resolution about 60 kilometers in the auroral zone. Is the resolution that we require to resolve various auroral processes, but also subauroral like SAPs, as well as polar cap density structures, such as storms of ionization and polar cap patches. And I'll mention these things earlier, later in the talk. So, like I said, there is no way to mention everything that is being done by this excellent team that we have. So I just wanted to highlight a few names of the early career scientists who are working on these different pieces of this problem, Harry Arnold at APL and Anthony Ciola also at APL. And I highlighted Anthony because he will be talking next week in this seminar at the same time. So you will hear more about his work. Some of the work that's done on the tail transition region, as well as auroral precipitation, is done by Adam Michael at APL, Dong Lin at NCAR, and Shanshan Bao at Rice. And Dong Lin will also with Anthony, will share the scene with Anthony next week. So we will hear about his work here. And also Shanshan is working on the plasmasphere plumes, which I'll mention also later. So I've mentioned about GAMERA earlier. I'll just briefly talk about this code. So it uses, because it serves sort of as a backbone of this entire MAGE framework. GAMERA is a code that solves at the very basic level the MHD equations. It's a fairly unique MHD code because it solves the equations on arbitrary hexahedral grids, including non-orthogonal and singular coordinates. It was written all in modern Fortran and uses multiple layers of parallelism, which means that it takes advantage of the modern architectures. We've published all of the standard MHD tests from the Athena group. As you can see here, this code is used now for multiple heliophysics domains, various magnetospheric, planetary magnetospheres, but also for the inner heliosphere. And I do want to emphasize that because the code is using what is called high order reconstruction, it requires relatively few cells to resolve the relevant physical processes, which means that if you lower the order of the scheme, the calculation becomes more and more expensive and sometimes prohibitive. In this particular example, I'm showing what we were able to do a few years ago with Karim Sarathia, who is the main developer of GAMERA, by really cranking the resolution very high up. And you can see here that we're able to resolve in the equatorial plane of the magnetosphere the ballooning interchange instability, which mapped to the ionosphere, created structures that looked like what they call the auroral beads. Here's sort of a one-to-one comparison, which looked similar enough to us, but you will see that even at this very high resolution, this simulation used something like 300 kilometer resolution in the magnetotail. We are sort of barely getting to the point of resolving the structures, but the main point was that it was the ballooning interchange instability or plasma ripples in the equatorial plane that we found was driving or were driving the auroral beads in the ionosphere, and we even got a little press release out of that. So moving on to what we've been using the MAGE model in terms of what we've been using it for in terms of doing science with it. I would like to here go briefly over some of the recent work for the three CGS science themes that we've identified. The first science theme in CGS is the multi-scale plasma sheet transport, ring current buildup, and their global impacts throughout the storm time geospace. I will try to explain this idea of this science theme with this image here, or this picture. What you see here is on the right in the equatorial plane is a snapshot of a GAMERA simulation. You'll see these bursty flows in the tail that are coming in and building up the ring current. There is an ongoing debate currently in the field about the, how big the role is of these bursty flows in building up the ring current. And it's challenging because some of the issues that I'll be discussing in the next few slides. But if these bursty flows contribute significantly to building up the ring current, then this, in essence, mesoscale process in the magnetosphere has truly global consequences through the entirety of geospace. The reason for that is because the ring current itself is a global structure that has global implications for the entire system. In particular, the ring current pressure gradients drive region 2, as we know, currents into the ionosphere, which flows through the region 1 currents. Therefore, the ring current not just changes the global structure of the geomagnetic field, but also where and how the currents close in the ionosphere, where therefore the energy is and momentum are deposited into the ionosphere thermosphere system, which is represented here by a TIGCM simulation. Once you start heating and dyne drag in the thermosphere, it also sort of stirs up, which creates global consequences for the magnetosphere, both through electrodynamic coupling, meaning by changing ionospheric conductance or conductivity in 3D, and also by providing mass outflow to the magnetosphere. So again, this is your demonstration of how, in essence, a mesoscale process in one of the domains of the global system creates global consequences for the entire geospace. And the particular issue of building up the ring current through bursty flows has been discussed in the community quite a lot, both through a multi-year GEM deep focus group and many AGU sessions, as well as multiple CGS workshops that we've run in the past 3 years. So let me talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done on this. So a couple of years ago, Karim Sarathi did this study where he ran the GAMERA MHD code at a very high resolution as well. And he then, here on the left, you can see the movie of that simulation in the equatorial plane. What's plotted here in color is the flux tube entropy, and you can see how these low entropy bubbles that correspond to bursty bulk flows penetrate into the inner magnetosphere and ultimately build up the ring current. In this particular simulation, what Karim did was he initiated a simulation of test particles using a very large ensemble of particles here, which were initiated, I think, tailward of this rectangular region, and then he calculated the various statistics of these particles. And the very short takeaway message from this paper that you can read at this link down below is that if when Karim looked at the statistics of particles that were initiated inside of these buoyant bubbles, the result was that even though they contributed to a relatively low fraction of the population, they contributed a lot to the transport and acceleration of particles, in particular in the injection of these particles into the ring current. So, for example, if you take just 3.5% of the total population of the buoyant, negative buoyancy, buoyant plasma structures, they contribute to 30% of transport or acceleration. And if you take 15% of the total population, they contribute about a half of total transport and acceleration. Moving on, this is more recent work from Anthony Ciola, which he'll talk about next week. So I don't want to steal his thunder. I'll just briefly mention the simulation. This is a GAMERA RCM coupled simulation of the 2013 St. Patrick's storm. This is a comparison of RB-SPICE and RCM. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this because Anthony will talk about this more next week. But what he did here was to take this arc at about 6 RE and calculate the transport of energy or energy flux through this arc into the ring current region inside structures of different scales. And so this is what's represented in this plot here. This is on the bottom here, you see the sort of space-time plot, kind of like a kilogram of the azimuthal angle, or MLT. In other words, midnight would be here in the center, and this is time. And so he looked at these mesoscale features in this simulation and computed how much they contributed to the ring current buildup. And long story short, they contribute a very large fraction, about at least a half, depending on how you quantify their impact. That's one point. The other point is that this energy or this contribution comes predominantly in the form of the enthalpy flux, thermal flux. So, however, the what I just presented to you were two different simulations. One used a global MHD code with test particles without feedback. The other used MHD RCM with feedback, but without taking into account the possibly non-adiabatic effects, but also the fact that even further out from the ring current region, sort of geosynchronous, and so which we usually use where we usually use models like RCM, even beyond that region, we know that non-thermal plasma pressure contributes significantly. This is from a test particle simulation, contributes significantly to the total plasma pressure. So we really need new types of models for this transition region, as we call it. And this is what we're experimenting or starting to experiment right now in the Center for Geospace Storms by including feedback from test particles in this region. So moving on to the second CGS Science Theme, some of the results that I'll present here are very, very new, haven't been published yet, but were presented at last AGU. The second science theme, we called it Storm Time Mesoscale Ionospheric Structure and Global Geospace Mass Circulation. There's a lot of discussion in the community about the circulation of what we call the core plasma, but what we would like to do here is to, again, realize the fact that some of the circulation occurs inside smaller than global structures, what we call mesoscale structures, and we would like to study these structures and their impact on the global geospace behavior. So in this particular case, we're kind of following in this diagram a sort of a life cycle of a plasma patch in the ionosphere, in the polar ionosphere. This is a TEC image in the upper left corner. Here you see this patch of density that's traveling across the polar cap. As it's moving across the polar cap, we know there are structures that are called polar wind jets. So polar wind itself is coming out of the polar cap in these relatively not small scale, but mesoscale structures, smaller than global scale. And we would like to know what are the impacts of these polar wind structures are in the global magnetosphere, but also as as a patch is moving across the polar cap into the night side. This is a very nice image from Seminar et al. From a lot of years ago, I forget now. So basically what you see is as the patch is coming into the auroral zone where there's heating, you can see upflow, ion upflow in that region. So again, the polar cap patch is traveling all the way to the night side and potentially contributing to a mesoscale outflow feature. This is what we would like to study, but to do that, we need to build models that are capable of tracking these structures, both in the ionosphere and through the outflow and into the magnetosphere. In addition, you can see here that the polar cap, this patch here doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's actually is protruding into the polar cap from this reservoir of mid-latitude, of plasma density at mid-latitudes. And this is what John Foster has called Geospace plume, John Foster and collaborators. All of these plasma structures and electrodynamic structures are part of one large circulation pattern, which, if you map, for example, this TEC plume that started breaking up into patches in this image on the upper left, if you map it out into the magnetosphere, it will look something like this. And we know from the work of John Foster and collaborators that these plumes map to plasmaspheric plumes, which in turn are strongly coupled to subarray electric fields. And so in order to understand all of this global coupled circulation of both mass and electrodynamic coupling involved in it, we need models that can treat all of these plasma populations and also global distribution of electric fields in the ionosphere and the magnetosphere. So this is what we're trying to do as well. This part about Geospace plume is something that Dongyan Lin and Shanshan Bao are spearheading, and I'm not going to talk about this more in this presentation, but I just wanted to highlight their names and their work. So look out for the papers coming out from these folks. But what I do want to highlight is the work that Roger Varney at UCLA with his postdoc Robert Albaran have been doing on the polar ionosphere, and in particular, Roger has been working on essentially rewriting his model IPWM, which is now called Hydra. Effectively, Hydra is the polar wind model that used to be known as IPWM, with reworked underlying numerics and some of the physics as well, and chemistry. But as far as numerics is concerned, it's using essentially the GAMERA transport numerical scheme to achieve higher resolution than would be possible otherwise. And so what you can see here is the polar ionosphere from one of Roger's simulations. This is, I believe, this is a 2005 storm simulation that was published earlier from Kevin Pham. And what you see here is the electron density at 400 kilometers, but also importantly, H plus flux at a much higher altitude. So this is essentially the outflow going into that would be going into the magnetosphere if this was a fully coupled simulation. And this goes back to the point I was making earlier, in that we know that predominantly from observations that the polar cap plasma structure, polar cap plasma density is structured. And so we would like to see how that affects the global magnetosphere, as we are starting to see in these highly resolved simulations. This just shows a comparison from this simulation as it would have been if it would have been done at a lower resolution than what I presented in the last slide. So this is the what was in the last slide, and this is twice smaller resolution and yet twice smaller. So we can see how you go from a relatively global outflow structure, in this case, to a very highly resolved and very structured polar cap, polar wind outflow in this plot on the right. Another very recent example from some of the simulations that we've been doing is the work that Bill Lotko at NCAR is doing. And Bill is interested in this particular work in sort of the optical feature that corresponds to this polar cap, mesoscale polar cap and cusp structures. In this case, he was looking at polarward moving auroral forms. This is just here to demonstrate what these things look like. These are auroral features that are coming from the day-side cusp into the polar cap. They are associated with the day-side reconnection, as is in particular shown in this recent paper by Huang, 2020. They have they exhibit specific features such as spatial scales and the speed with which they propagate into the polar cap, and they also correspond to the density structures such as polar cap patches. So in this work that Bill presented at AGU, he used the MAGE simulation to try to reproduce these polarward moving auroral forms, which he did. So again, in this kilogram-like plot, this is magnetic latitude and this is time. You can see how the polarward, I'll call them PMAPs, how they were moving into the polar cap. And in this plot, they're represented by the downward, by the alphanic flux in the simulation. So one of the major findings of this work was that these poleward moving auroral forms are actually alphanic forms. They correspond to the alphanic flux in the simulation that was estimated in the simulation. And another important result from this work was that practically no alphanic flux is reflected, so most of it is absorbed at low altitudes. Again, just to emphasize this one more time, none of these simulations or none of these results would be possible if you didn't use a global simulation with sufficiently high resolving power to track these mesoscale features, in this case in the polar ionosphere. So, like I said, I'll just very quickly flash this slide without going into detail about the last CGS Science Theme, just because it's outside of the scope of the magnetosphere seminar. But this is where we work on studying the effects of both driving from above, from the magnetosphere, and driving from below, from the middle and lower atmosphere on the IT system. In this case, I'm highlighting two relatively recent papers from Joe Huba and co-workers. In the first case, which is actually represented in this diagram, they used a WACMX simulation with gravity waves. Some part of the spectrum of gravity waves resolved to show that how they seeded equatorial bubbles. This is a representation from the SEMI simulation, which was driven from below by WACMX. And it showed these equatorial bubbles, which looked very similar morphologically, at least, to the NASA Gold observations. And more recently, Joe did another very, very nice GRL study where he showed in a similar setup with a different lower atmosphere model how a Tonga volcano in the simulation led to the seeding of the equatorial bubbles. So you can check Joe's papers there, and we will be working more over the 5 years on coupling all of these domains from the lower atmosphere to the magnetosphere and studying their effects on the IT system. So this brings me to the conclusion of this talk. I'll just go over this quickly. Modeling of geospace atmosphere system, particularly during storm disturbances, has 3 key requirements. We need to treat this system holistically. We need to resolve and treat appropriately physically the various mesoscale processes that exist in all of the involved domains of this system, and we need to couple properly to the lower atmosphere. This is essentially what we're doing in the Center for Geospace Storms by developing the MAGE model. I've demonstrated some recent examples of our work. In a couple of cases, they will be presented more in depth next week by our early career scientists. Anthony Siola will talk about the buildup of the ring current, and Dong Lin, I actually didn't talk about these results today. He'll talk about much more about how we deal with auroral precipitation in our model. So he'll talk about this next week. And there's a whole lot of other problems that we're trying to solve with the MAGE model as we move on with its development. Some of the recent results on SAPS were published by Dong Lin. We've done traveling atmospheric and ionospheric disturbances in a couple of papers shown here. And I mentioned Shanshan Bao at Rice is working on the Geospace plume, and Joe Huba has worked on the equatorial bubbles seeded by the Tonga volcano eruption. But as I said, there are many more missing puzzles from this problem. Many pieces missing from this puzzle that is the storm time geospace, and we're going to be dealing with these issues in the next 5 years, hopefully. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Slava, for a wonderful talk. It was really detailed. You guys, this group is doing a lot of work. We do have a couple questions from the chat. Patricia Reef is interested to know a little bit more about your planetarium show. She currently has one as well called Magnetism.
Okay, yeah, so I can sort of give a long answer maybe offline, but the short answer is that a few years ago, before the pandemic, we worked with the American Natural History Museum on this show that they initiated, which is now playing across the country. It's called Worlds Beyond Earth. And so it has sort of many pieces to it, different planets. While the Earth's magnetosphere, for that sequence in the planetarium show, they worked with us. And so we created a storm simulation, which we passed on to them, and they produced this wonderful visualization that is now playing across the country in the planetariums.
Very cool. Yeah, I just quickly searched it, and there are a lot of places showing it around the US. So if you search for the name Worlds Beyond Earth, you should be able to find a showing in your region. So Krishna has another question. Could you briefly explain the connection between BBFs and ring current dynamics? They might have missed it in the talk.
Right, so this is, as I said, this is a very interesting question that a lot of people in the community are currently pursuing, which is, we know from the work that was done back in the 90s in the field by Baum-Johann and Angelopoulos in particular, that much of the plasma transport in the magnetotail occurs in the form of these bursty flows, which we call bursty bulk flows, which are relatively small scale compared to the global magnetosphere scale. Later, it was shown that they're about 1 to 3 RE across the tail size. And so later, especially during the Van Allen probes era, was shown that the ring current is often injected in these what people think are localized injections. And so the question is, what is the connection between the bursty bulk flows and the further in the tail and these localized injections in the ring current, and how big is the contribution of these localized injections into the ring current buildup? From the models, there's been a number of papers in recent years using different models. It seems that the contribution is very significant, but observationally, this is a very difficult problem to solve, obviously, because we don't have a distributed set of measurements to track it appropriately. So it's still an open question. but the simulations are hinting at the fact that the contribution of these bursty flows is significant.
Excellent, thank you. So I have one additional question. In your simulations, when you're talking about the ring current, you did show some, not observations, but some calculations of modeled DST. Is your guys' new simulation setup able to do ground-based magnetometers so that you could eventually start looking at GICs within your simulations?
Yes. We thank you for the question. We are doing a lot of that, and I don't know if Anthony is going to talk about this next week or not, but we're looking at SMR, which you, Kyle, obviously know about. So sectorial resolution of the DST stations, as well as high latitude and mid latitude stations as well. So there is a lot of physics that we're missing by looking just at DST. We are very well aware of that, and so we're looking at detailed sectorial resolution of the ground signal as well.
Very cool. All right, thanks, Slava. So that's all the questions we have today. We will be continuing some discussion on the Center for Geospace Storms next week, as Slava has alluded to. We have 2 early career talks. Dong Lin will be discussing characterizing auroral precipitation and ionospheric conductance with the multi-scale atmospheric geospace environment model, or MAGE. And Anthony Ciola will follow this up with a discussion of the buildup of the storm time ring current via mesoscale plasma sheet flows, which I believe will go into more detail to your question, Krishna. So if we have no other questions, I'd like to thank you again, Slava, for your time and for a wonderful talk, and I hope to see everyone next week.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all for listening to this. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a wonderful week, everyone.